Thomas Ryder was 12 years old when he learned that loneliness could be a physical ache. Not the dramatic loneliness of stories, no tragic isolation or cruel abandonment. Just the quiet, persistent loneliness of being the only child on a frontier colony world, where the nearest neighbor was 50 kilometers away, and your best friends were the chickens you helped raise and the ancient dog who slept through most of the day. Kepler 447d was beautiful in its own way. Rolling grasslands that shifted colors with the seasons, two small moons that created strange tide patterns in the distant oceans, and skies that showed constellations no one from Earth had ever seen. His parents had come here as part of the third wave of agricultural settlement, hardy souls willing to spend years alone, building the farming infrastructure that would eventually support larger colonies. They were good parents, loving and attentive, but they were also busy from dawn to dusk, managing the crops and livestock that kept their settlement viable. So Thomas had become comfortable with his own company. He'd read every book in their digital library twice, could recite most of his favorite stories from memory, and had developed extensive imaginary games to pass the long hours between chores. He told himself he was fine, that he didn't need friends his own age, that the loneliness was just something you got used to, like the way the gravity on Kepler 447d was slightly lighter than Earth standard and made you feel like you were constantly about to float away. Then came the night that changed everything. He was outside, allegedly checking on the chicken coops, but actually just stargazing because the aurora was particularly beautiful, ribbons of green and purple light dancing across the northern horizon. He was supposed to go back inside. His mother worried about the native predators that sometimes prowled the perimeter, but he'd gotten distracted trying to find Earth's sun among the unfamiliar star patterns. It was a game he played sometimes, though he'd never actually succeeded. That's when he saw the streak of fire across the sky. At first, he thought it was a meteor. They got those occasionally, pieces of debris burning up in the atmosphere. But this one was moving too slowly, descending rather than burning up, and it was heading for the ridge about 2 kilometers north of their settlement. Thomas watched it disappear behind the hills, followed by a sound like distant thunder. Something had crashed. Something big enough to make noise he could hear from this distance. He should have gotten his parents, should have followed protocol for unexplained phenomena on frontier worlds, report to colony administration, let the adults handle it. But he was 12, he was lonely, and more than anything he was desperately curious. He grabbed a flashlight, left a note saying he'd gone to check the North Fields and started walking. The crashed ship, because it was definitely a ship, not just debris, had carved a trench through the grassland, coming to rest against a cluster of rocks that had probably saved it from complete destruction. It was small, barely larger than their agricultural hauler, and shaped like nothing Thomas had seen before. Smooth surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, no obvious windows or doors, and symbols etched along the hull that his translator implant couldn't even begin to interpret. And sitting beside the wreckage, knees pulled up to her chest, was a girl. She looked about his age, at least he thought so, though it was hard to tell with someone who definitely wasn't human. Her skin was pale blue, like morning sky just before sunrise, and she had large eyes that were currently streaming tears, though she made no sound. Her ears were pointed and swept back from her head in a way that would have looked strange if it hadn't somehow fit her face perfectly. She wore clothing that might have been white once, but was now torn and stained with something dark that made Thomas worry she was injured. She looked up when his flashlight beam found her, and the expression of terror on her face made Thomas instantly feel guilty for scaring her. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, raising his hands to show he wasn't armed. "I'm not going to hurt you. I saw you crash. Are you okay? Are you hurt?" The translator in his ear struggled with her response, fragmentary words in a language it barely recognized. "Please not they find, please." She was terrified. Of him. Of whoever she'd been running from. Both. Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He sat down, making himself smaller and less threatening, keeping his distance but close enough that she could see him clearly in the moonlight. "It's okay," he said, keeping his voice soft like he did with frightened animals. "I'm just a kid. I live on a farm over there." He pointed vaguely south. "Nobody else knows you're here. I won't tell anyone if you don't want me to." The translator did better with his words, apparently because her expression shifted from terror to something more like desperate hope. She said something longer this time, and the translator managed. "You, help, they come. I need hide. Please help." Thomas made a decision that would change his entire life, though he didn't know it then. He nodded. "I'll help you. Can you walk? I can hide you in our storage shed. It's warm and dry and nobody goes in there except me. I can bring you food." Getting her back to the settlement was harder than expected. She was injured, nothing obviously broken but moving with pain that suggested bruises or worse. Thomas ended up supporting most of her weight, which was surprisingly light despite her being slightly taller than him. They moved slowly through the dark grassland, and Thomas found himself talking to fill the silence, explaining where they were, what Kepler 447d was like, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt her. He didn't know if she understood most of it, but she seemed to relax slightly as he rambled. He got her settled in the storage shed with blankets he smuggled from the house, promising to bring food in the morning. She watched him with those huge eyes, and just before he left she reached out and touched his hand carefully, like she was afraid he might disappear. "Thank," she said in careful translator-mediated English. "You, kind." "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Valerie," she said, and it came through the translator clearly. "I'm Thomas. I'll come back tomorrow, Valerie. I promise you're safe here." He snuck back into his house, invented a story about checking the distant irrigation systems, and lay awake for hours wondering what he'd just gotten himself into and whether he just made the best or worst decision of his young life. The next day, Thomas discovered that having a secret friend made the loneliness disappear entirely. He brought Valerie food, bread, cheese, some fruit from their greenhouse, and found her huddled in the same corner where he'd left her. But now she was looking slightly less terrified and more curious about her surroundings. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling down across from her, leaving space so she didn't feel crowded. "Hurt less," she said, the translator handling her words more smoothly now that it had more language samples to work with. "You not tell parents?" "No, you said you needed to hide. I figured you had your reasons." Thomas paused. "Who were you running from?" Valerie's expression darkened. "War, my people, other people, fighting, long time fighting. Ship attacked, I escaped pod. Parents tell me run if danger, so I run." She was a refugee, a kid fleeing war, just like in the historical vids Thomas had watched about old Earth conflicts. "Are your parents okay? Are they looking for you?" "Don't know, hope yes, hope they send rescue." She looked at him with those huge eyes. "You not scared of me, I alien, you human, we not same." "You're scared and hurt and alone," Thomas said practically. "That's all the same I need. Being human or alien doesn't really matter when you're just trying to not be lonely, right?" Valerie stared at him for a long moment, then made a sound the translator interpreted as a laugh. "You strange human boy, good strange." Over the next 3 weeks, they became inseparable. Thomas would complete his morning chores in record time, then spend hours in the storage shed with Valerie. He taught her better English and learned bits of her language. She told him about her homeworld, cities that floated on clouds, oceans that glowed at night, festivals where everyone sang together in harmonies that humans couldn't quite hear properly. He told her about Earth from what he knew from books and his parents' stories, about the frontier colonies, about being the only kid for kilometers in any direction. They played games. Thomas taught her chess, though the translator struggled with some of the piece names. Valerie taught him a strategy game from her world that involved stones and patterns he couldn't quite grasp but enjoyed anyway. They told each other stories, shared fears about the future, and found in each other the friendship both of them desperately needed. Thomas learned that Valari was actually the daughter of someone important in her world's government, not royalty exactly, but high-ranking enough that her escape pod had contained things that marked her as valuable. She was careful not to activate any of the communication equipment, worried it might draw the wrong kind of attention. But she was also clearly used to better conditions than a storage shed on a frontier farm, and Thomas felt guilty every time he saw her trying to get comfortable on piles of fertilizer bags. On the 18th day, Valari touched the communication beacon in her escape pod, making the decision that it was safer to risk rescue than to remain indefinitely in hiding. 2 days later, sleek ships appeared in Kepler 447D's sky. Nothing like the rough utilitarian craft humans used, but elegant vessels that moved through atmosphere like dancers. Thomas was with Valari when the rescue party found them. Armed soldiers who looked like older versions of Valari, speaking rapidly in their language, checking her for injuries, clearly both relieved and furious that she'd been alone for weeks. One of them, an older woman with scars across her face and the bearing of someone in command, spoke to Thomas in halting English. "You protect her. Keep safe." "Yes, ma'am, she was hurt when she crashed. I just wanted to help." The woman studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. She bowed, a deep formal gesture that made the other soldiers look surprised. "My people owe you debt. You show honor protecting child not your own." "I just did what anyone would do," Thomas said, uncomfortable with the formality. "Not anyone," the woman said, "but you did. We remember this." They prepared to leave, and Thomas realized he was about to lose the best friend he'd ever had. Valari seemed to realize it too, because she pulled away from the soldiers and ran back to Thomas, grabbing his hands. "I not want go," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You my friend. Only friend who see me not as important family, just as me." "I know," Thomas said, his own eyes stinging. "But you have to go. Your family is looking for you. You need to go home." "I come back," Valari insisted. "When grow up, when can choose, I come back." "Maybe," Thomas said, not believing it but not wanting to hurt her with the truth that they'd probably never see each other again. Different species, different worlds, different lives waiting for them. Valari gripped his hands tighter. "No, not maybe, promise. When I grow up I will marry you, I promise. You my best friend, I not forget." Thomas laughed, not unkindly but because it was such a child's vow, sweet and impossible, and the kind of thing kids said when they didn't understand how the universe worked. "Okay, Valari. When you grow up, you can come back and marry me." She smiled through her tears, and then she was being gently pulled away by her people, loaded onto their sleek ship, and lifted into the sky. Thomas watched until the ships were just bright dots disappearing into the stars. Then he walked back to his storage shed that felt emptier than it had before Valari had hidden there, and he tried to convince himself that the ache in his chest was just the loneliness coming back, not anything more complicated or permanent. He was 12 years old. She was probably something similar in her species' development. They'd been friends for 3 weeks. It was the kind of friendship that should have faded into fond memory, the vow, the kind of childish promise that everyone understood wasn't real. Thomas had no way of knowing that for Valari's people, promises made were sacred regardless of age, that she would carry his memory forward through decades and vast distances, that the vow she made that day would become the foundation for decisions that would shape both their futures. He went back to his lonely life on Kepler 447D, returned to his chickens and his books and his imaginary games. He told his parents about the alien girl eventually. They were concerned he'd hidden someone but proud he'd helped, and the story became a family tale, the time young Thomas befriended an alien refugee. The years passed. Thomas grew up, left the farm for university, studied agricultural engineering, came back to help expand the settlement, had relationships that never quite worked out for reasons he could never quite articulate, built a good life, a satisfying life, but always with that small hollow space where the friendship with Valari had lived. He thought about her sometimes, wondered if she'd made it home, if she remembered him, if she'd laughed about her childish promise to marry the human boy who'd hidden her in a storage shed. He never imagined she'd spent 25 years becoming the kind of powerful leader who could actually keep that promise. Never imagined she would return. But she did. 25 years after Valari's rescue ship lifted from Kepler 447d, Thomas Ryder stood in the same fields his parents had tended, watching the same two moons rise over the horizon, and thinking that his life had turned out reasonably well despite not being particularly remarkable. At 37, he was managing director of the expanded agricultural settlement, 60 families now instead of just his parents' isolated homestead. The colony had grown prosperous, their crops were feeding 3 other frontier worlds, and Thomas had earned respect as someone who could solve practical problems with creative thinking. He'd never married, despite a few relationships over the years. His last girlfriend, Maria, had ended things 6 months ago with the gentle observation that Thomas always seemed to be waiting for something, though neither of them could quite identify what. She'd been right, probably, though Thomas would have been hard-pressed to explain what exactly he was waiting for. So when the communication came through on what started as an ordinary Tuesday morning, colony administrator requesting his immediate presence for urgent first contact protocol situation, Thomas assumed it was a mistake. Kepler 447d had minimal strategic or political importance. They grew crops. They occasionally traded with passing merchant vessels. Nobody practiced first contact protocols here. But he went to the colony's administrative building anyway, and found it surrounded by security forces looking nervous and excited in equal measure. Inside, the small conference room that usually hosted crop rotation planning meetings had been transformed into something approximating a diplomatic reception area. Hastily hung decorative panels, furniture arranged in formal patterns, and colony officials wearing their best clothing despite it being barely past dawn. Colony Administrator Reeves grabbed Thomas the moment he entered. "Thank God. They're asking specifically for you. We have no idea why, but we're not about to question aliens who arrived in warships that could flatten the entire colony if they wanted to." What Thomas's brain was struggling to process. What aliens, what warships, and why would they want me? That's what we're hoping you can tell us. Reeves looked genuinely worried. They've been in orbit for 6 hours. Perfect diplomatic protocols, no aggression, but they're refusing to state their purpose until they speak with you specifically. Thomas Ryder of Kepler 447d Settlement 7. That's you, right? That's me, Thomas confirmed, his mind racing through possibilities. Had he accidentally violated some interstellar trade regulation? Was this about the black market tech his settlement had purchased 3 years ago for the irrigation systems? What species are they? That's the thing nobody knows. They're not in any of our databases, new to human contact entirely, but they're clearly advanced. Their ships make our best vessels look like children's toys. Before Thomas could ask more questions, the doors to the conference room opened and the delegation entered. They were beautiful. That was Thomas's first thought, immediately followed by recognition so strong it physically staggered him. The delegation consisted of 6 individuals, all with that distinctive pale blue skin, those large expressive eyes, those elegant pointed ears swept back from their heads. They wore formal attire that looked like someone had taken starlight and woven it into fabric, shimmering material that shifted colors subtly with movement. And at the center of the delegation, wearing the most elaborate version of the formal attire, with a circlet on her head that had to be some kind of crown, was someone Thomas would have recognized even after a century. Valari. She was taller than he remembered, easily 6 feet now, with bearing that spoke of authority and power. Her features had matured from childhood roundness into elegant strength, but her eyes were the same. Those huge, expressive eyes that had watched him with desperate hope 25 years ago. now watching him with something that looked like joy and nervousness and determination all mixed together. She smiled, brilliant and genuine, and spoke in English that was now perfect, no translator necessary. "Hello, Thomas Ryder. I told you I would return." Thomas's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Everyone in the room was staring at him, clearly expecting him to say something, but his brain had completely stopped functioning. This couldn't be real. Valari couldn't be here. And she definitely couldn't be here wearing a crown and commanding warships and asking for him specifically. He managed finally. "Valari. Yeah, promised I would return to marry him. I am here to fulfill that promise and to propose alliance between our peoples through our union." Alliance, Reeves finally found his voice. "Your Majesty, with all respect, Kepler 447d is a small agricultural colony. We don't have the authority to negotiate interstellar alliances. You need to speak with Earth's central government, or the Colonial Administration Board, or—" "I am not here to negotiate with your governments," Valari interrupted, though her tone remained polite. "I am here to marry the man who saved me. Political alliance is consequence of that personal commitment, not the purpose of it. Though I suspect your governments will be very interested in formal relations with my empire once they understand our capabilities and strategic position." She turned back to Thomas. "I know this is sudden. I know 25 years is a long time, and you may not remember our friendship as clearly as I do. I know I am asking something enormous, but I remember everything, Thomas. Every story you told me, every game you taught me, every moment you made me feel safe when I was terrified. I have never forgotten, and I would very much like the opportunity to know you again, as adults, and to see if the promise I made as a child can become something real between us now." Thomas's mind was chaos. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately. Valari was here, the childhood friend he'd thought lost forever, and some part of him had apparently been waiting for exactly this for 25 years. But another part was screaming that this was insane, that you didn't just marry someone because of a promise made at 12, that there were political implications here he couldn't even begin to understand. He cleared his throat. "Can we talk, privately, without the entire colony administration watching?" Valari's expression brightened with visible relief. "Yes, of course, that would be appropriate." She dismissed her delegation with a gesture, and they filed out, though several looked deeply unhappy about leaving their queen alone with humans. The colonial administrators were shooed out by Reeves, who gave Thomas a look that clearly said, "Figure out what's happening and report immediately." Then it was just Thomas and Valari, standing in a makeshift diplomatic conference room on a frontier colony world, separated by 25 years and countless light years, but connected by a promise made by children under distant stars. "So," Thomas said, because someone had to break the silence, "you became queen." "I did," Valari said, and he noticed she was nervous. Her fingers were moving in small, repetitive patterns that he dimly remembered as a stress response. "My grandmother ruled for 300 years. When she died, succession passed through my mother's line to me. It has been challenging." "I bet," Thomas gestured to the chairs around the conference table. "Should we sit? This is a lot to process standing up." They sat, and Thomas studied her more carefully now. She was beautiful, not in a human way exactly, but there was elegance to her features, intelligence in her eyes, and something in the way she carried herself that spoke of someone who'd learned to bear weight Thomas couldn't imagine. "Why?" he asked finally. "I mean, I understand you said the promise is important in your culture, but you're a queen. You command warships. You rule an empire I've never even heard of, which means you're probably important on galactic scales I don't understand. Why would you come all this way, risk potential diplomatic complications, to marry some farmer you knew for 3 weeks when you were 12? Valari was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "In my culture, we believe that vows made in moments of genuine emotion are more binding than any political contract. When I promised to marry you, I was scared, alone, certain I would never see my family again. You were the only kindness I knew in the universe at that moment. That makes the promise sacred." She leaned forward slightly. "But it is more than cultural obligation. Thomas, do you know what it is like to rule? To have millions of people looking to you for guidance, to make decisions that determine life and death, to be surrounded constantly by advisors and courtiers and nobles, all wanting something from you. I have not had a genuine friend, someone who sees me as simply Valari rather than Queen Valari, since the day your planet's sun disappeared behind my rescue ship." Her voice dropped. "I have thought about you constantly. Wondered if you remembered me. Wondered if you had married, had children, built a life. Wondered if my promise was foolish child sentiment that meant nothing to you. But I also remembered the way you looked at me when I was frightened. Like I mattered, not because of who my family was, but because I was a person who needed help. No one has looked at me that way in 25 years. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. "So you're here because you're lonely." "I am here because 25 years ago, I found someone who saw me clearly, and I have never found that again. Yes, I am lonely, terribly lonely. But I am also certain that what we had, even as children, even for only 3 weeks, was real. And I want to know if it could be real again." "But you don't know me anymore," Thomas protested. "I was 12, you were 12, we're completely different people now." "Then let us learn who those people are." Valari's expression was earnest. "I am not demanding immediate marriage. I am asking for opportunity to know each other again, to see if the connection we had can grow into something appropriate for adults, to discover if the promise I made was childish fantasy or genuine recognition of something worth building on. And if we discover it was fantasy, if we don't work, then I return to my empire. We establish diplomatic relations between our peoples because that benefits everyone. And I release you from any obligation you might feel toward a vow made by children." "But Thomas," she reached across the table, stopping just short of touching his hand, "will you give me the chance to find out? Will you let me try to prove that the girl who promised to marry you meant every word, and that the woman she became still means it?" Thomas looked at her hand hovering near his, at her eyes watching him with hope and vulnerability that reminded him exactly of the frightened child in his storage shed. He thought about Maria's observation that he was waiting for something, about the hollow space in his life that no relationship had quite filled, about the fact that some part of him had apparently never moved past the 3 weeks when he hadn't been lonely. "I have a farm to run," he said finally. "Responsibilities, people depending on me, I can't just leave. I would not ask you to, I can stay here, learn about your world, help with your work if you permit it. I have time, Thomas. I can be patient. Your advisors are going to hate this. They will adapt." Valari's expression turned slightly mischievous. "I am queen. They serve me, not the other way around. Let them be unhappy. I have been unhappy in service to duty for 25 years. Perhaps now duty can serve my happiness instead." Thomas found himself smiling despite everything. There was the girl he remembered, the one who'd made sarcastic comments about being important family, who'd laughed at his terrible jokes, who'd had spirit beneath the fear. She was still there inside the queen. "Okay," he said. "You can stay, we'll figure this out, but Valari, I'm not promising anything. No commitment until we actually know if this can work. That is all I ask." She did touch his hand now, carefully, like she was afraid he might pull away. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I know how strange this must be." "Strange is an understatement," Thomas said dryly. "But I guess I've dealt with strange before. I once hid an alien princess in my storage shed and taught her chess. This is just the sequel to that story." Valari laughed, a sound Thomas hadn't heard in 25 years but recognized instantly. And despite all the complications, all the political implications, all the logical reasons this was insane, Thomas felt that hollow space in his chest begin to fill with something like hope. Maybe childhood promises weren't always foolish. Maybe some connections transcended time and distance. Maybe, Just maybe. The girl who said, "I will marry you," and the boy who laughed had both been seeing something real that just needed 25 years to grow into possibility. The universe was strange. Love was stranger. And Thomas was about to find out exactly how strange things could get when a queen decided that promises made under distant stars were worth keeping, no matter what it cost. The next 6 weeks were possibly the strangest of Thomas's life, which was saying something considering his childhood had included hiding an alien refugee, and his adulthood had involved running an agricultural operation on a frontier world. Valerie stayed, not in the administrative building where diplomatic guests would normally be housed, but in a small residence that the colony hurriedly constructed from prefab units, something appropriate for visiting dignitaries but not ostentatiously royal. Her delegation insisted she needed security, proper accommodations, facilities for conducting imperial business. She overruled all of them and announced she would be staying in the small 4-room unit they'd built, alone except for 2 guards who could remain outside, and she would be learning about human agricultural operations because that was Thomas's work, and understanding his life was the entire purpose of being here. Her council was horrified. Thomas was overwhelmed, and the entire colony was absolutely fascinated by the alien queen who'd apparently come to marry one of their own. Thomas had insisted they start slowly. No talk of marriage, no pressure, just spending time together and seeing if they could actually function as adults who enjoyed each other's company. Valerie agreed, though he suspected she found his caution amusing rather than reasonable. The first week was awkward. Thomas showed her around the settlement, introduced her to the farming operations, tried to explain crop rotation and soil management to someone who'd never thought about where food came from before. Valerie listened with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions, and occasionally said things that revealed just how different their backgrounds were. "So you personally work in these fields?" she asked, watching him check irrigation systems. "Of course. Everyone in agricultural management does hands-on work. How else would we understand what we're managing? On my world, those of royal birth do not typically perform manual labor. We have people for such tasks." She paused. "That sounds terrible when I say it aloud, like I am claiming to be too important for real work." "Are you too important for real work?" Thomas asked, curious rather than judgmental. "I do not know. I have never tried. Perhaps I should learn." She held out her hand for the tool he was using. "Show me what you are doing." "I wish to understand." So Thomas taught a queen how to adjust irrigation flow regulators, and found himself enjoying her genuine curiosity about systems she'd never considered before. She was quick to learn, unafraid to get dirty, and had a talent for identifying inefficiencies in their systems that someone with fresh eyes could see, but people used to the process missed. By the second week, Valerie was spending full days working alongside Thomas and the other agricultural staff. She'd acquired practical clothing, human work gear that looked strange with her blue skin and pointed ears, but that she wore without self-consciousness. She learned to drive the automated harvesters, helped repair equipment when things broke down, and proved surprisingly good at the problem-solving required when technology didn't cooperate. The settlement's residents, initially intimidated by the royal visitor, slowly relaxed around her as they realized she genuinely wanted to be useful rather than just observed. Children approached her shyly, fascinated by someone who looked so different. Valerie answered their questions with patience, showed them pictures of her homeworld, and let them touch her pointed ears, which apparently was the height of excitement for 8-year-olds. Thomas watched her interact with the colony and saw glimpses of the child he'd known, curious, adaptable, finding joy in small things. But he also saw the queen, someone who made decisions with confidence, who commanded respect without demanding it, who'd clearly spent years learning to read people and situations. They talked, long conversations during lunch breaks or in the evenings after work was done. Valerie told him about her world, The floating cities she'd mentioned as a child were real, massive structures kept aloft by technology Thomas couldn't quite understand. She described growing up in the palace, the pressure of knowing she would someday rule, the endless training in governance and diplomacy and warfare. Warfare? Thomas asked. You fight? I was trained in combat, yes. All Valeri royalty are. We must be able to defend ourselves and our people. I am quite skilled with several weapons. I could demonstrate, though I suspect your colony lacks proper training facilities. We have a shooting range for predator control, Thomas offered. That will suffice. So the next day, Thomas found himself watching Valeri handle human weapons with ease, her marksmanship far exceeding his own. She made it look effortless, which was simultaneously impressive and slightly intimidating. You're scary when you're competent, he said when she'd completed a perfect scoring run. I am always competent, she replied with a smile. You simply noticed because this competence involves weapons. I was equally competent yesterday when repairing the harvester transmission. Fair point, scary in both contexts. Does it bother you that I am skilled in violence? Thomas considered that. No, actually. It's just different from what I'm used to. Most people here are farmers, not warriors. But I guess if you're responsible for an entire empire, you need to be ready for threats. Yes. Though I confess I prefer farming to fighting. Valeri set down the weapon carefully. There is something peaceful about helping things grow rather than destroying them. I understand now why you chose to return here rather than pursue other opportunities. This life you have built has value beyond political importance. Does that surprise you? It surprises me that I find it appealing. A month ago, I would have said that small-scale agriculture on a frontier world was insignificant compared to ruling an empire. Now I think perhaps I had my priorities backwards. Empires are important, but so are the people who actually feed everyone. You do work that matters daily. I do work that matters across decades or centuries. I am not certain which is more valuable. They fell into comfortable silence. The kind that Thomas had learned was its own form of communication. After 3 weeks together, they developed a rhythm, working side by side, talking when there was something to say, existing together in quiet when there wasn't. It was easy in ways Thomas hadn't expected. One evening, sitting on the small porch of Valeri's temporary residence, watching Kepler 447D's two moons rise, Thomas asked the question that had been building. Do you regret it? Spending 25 years preparing to fulfill a promise made by a child. You could have married someone from your own species, formed political alliances, done what queens are supposed to do. Instead you came here looking for me. Are you sure that wasn't just nostalgia for a time when life was simpler? Valeri was quiet for a long time, her gaze on the moons. I will tell you something I have told very few people. When I was rescued from your world, I was terrified. Terrified of returning to my family's expectations, to the life of nobility, to knowing I would someday rule. For 3 weeks with you, I had been just Valeri. Just a girl who played games and told stories, and did not have to be perfect or important. That freedom was the most valuable thing I had ever experienced. She turned to look at him. So yes, perhaps some of my desire to return was nostalgia. But it was also recognition that you had given me something I never found again, the ability to be myself without performance or pretense. Every relationship I attempted over the years failed because I could not escape being queen. Every potential match saw my position before seeing me. But you hid me in a storage shed and taught me chess and told me about chickens. You saw me as simply a frightened girl who needed help. And you think I can still do that, see you as just Valeri. You have been doing it for 3 weeks. When you explain irrigation systems, you are not explaining to a queen. You are explaining to someone you think will find it interesting. When you joke about my terrible aim with wrenches, you are not deferring to royalty. You are teasing a friend. That is what I came here to find. Thomas let that settle. What happens if this works? If we actually decide we want to be together, your empire isn't going to be thrilled about their queen bonding with a human farmer, and humanity's government is going to have opinions about political implications. This isn't just about us. No, it is not. But I am queen. My choice matters. My council can object, but they cannot overrule me. As for your government, she smiled, I suspect they will be very interested in positive relations with my empire once they understand our technological capabilities and strategic position. A queen's marriage to a human will facilitate those relations whether anyone likes it or not. That's a lot of pressure on what started as a childhood promise. Yes, but sometimes pressure creates diamonds rather than dust. We will not know which until we try. She paused. Are you afraid, Thomas, of what this could become? He considered lying or deflecting, but they'd been honest with each other so far. Yeah, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I'll disappoint you, that the boy you remember doesn't match the man I became. I'm afraid of leaving this world and everything I've built. I'm afraid of becoming the human who married the alien queen and losing myself in your shadow. And I'm afraid that maybe this is working because it's temporary. Situation. Valari's council was debating how to handle a queen who'd apparently abandoned propriety for a human farmer. The entire settlement was watching their queen and their agricultural director with fascination. But in that moment on that porch, they were just Thomas and Valari again. Two people who'd been friends as children, trying to figure out if they could be something more as adults. No pressure, no promises, just possibility. And that, Thomas thought, was exactly what both of them needed. 8 weeks after Valari's arrival, Thomas woke up one morning with absolute clarity. He was in love with her. Not because of a childhood promise or political pressure or the weirdness of the situation, but because over 2 months of working together, talking together, simply existing together, she'd become essential to his life in ways that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with who they both were now. He was in love with the way she approached problems, analyzing them with that same careful focus she'd shown as a child, but with adult competence that made her conclusions actually useful. He was in love with her laugh, which came more easily now than when she'd first arrived, as if she was remembering how to be joyful. He was in love with her random observations about human culture that were simultaneously insightful and hilarious. He was in love with the fact that she could discuss galactic politics one moment and help him coax a stubborn engine back to life the next without losing competence in either context. And most of all, he was in love with the simple fact that she saw him, really saw him, the way she had 25 years ago, not as agricultural director or potential political asset or means to an end, but as Thomas, someone worth knowing for his own sake. The realization should have been terrifying. Instead, it was clarifying. Like something that had been slightly out of focus for his entire adult life had suddenly sharpened into clear vision. He found her in the greenhouse that morning, carefully examining tomato plants that one of the colony children had asked her to help with. She'd taken to spending time with the settlement's kids, teaching them about her world while learning about theirs, and Thomas had watched her natural rapport with children and thought about futures neither of them had directly mentioned yet. "Valari," he said from the greenhouse entrance, "can we talk?" She looked up, and something in his expression made her set down the plant analysis tool immediately. "Of course. What is wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. But I need to tell you something, and I'd rather do it somewhere private. Can you come to my place?" They walked in silence to Thomas's home, a modest structure he'd built himself, expanded over the years from the original prefab unit. Once inside, he gestured for her to sit but found he couldn't sit himself, too much nervous energy. "I've been thinking about us," he began, then paused because that was inadequate. "Actually, I've been thinking about nothing except us for the past few weeks, and I've come to some conclusions I need to share with you before this goes any further." Valari's expression was carefully neutral. "I am listening." "When you first arrived, I thought you were crazy. A queen traveling light years to marry someone she knew for 3 weeks as a child. It seemed like the worst kind of romantic delusion. I agreed to let you stay because of curiosity and nostalgia, and because some part of me never moved past that friendship we had. But I didn't really believe the promise meant anything beyond childhood sentiment. And now, her voice was careful. Now I think you were seeing something I was too cautious to see. Or maybe it wasn't there then and we created it over these past 2 months. I don't know which. But Valerie, he moved to sit across from her, needing to see her face clearly. I'm in love with you. Not with the memory of you, not with the idea of you, but with you as you are now. With the woman who learned to drive harvesters and repairs equipment and makes children laugh. With the queen who's competent and powerful, but also genuinely kind. With my friend who's become more than friend without me quite noticing when it happened. Valerie's breath caught, her large eyes widening. Thomas. I'm not done, he interrupted gently. I need to say all of this before I lose my nerve. I love you, and I want to marry you if you still want that. Not because of your promise, though I'm honored you kept it. Not because of political alliance, though I'm sure our governments will be thrilled. But because I genuinely want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you. I want to face whatever challenges come together. I want to teach you more terrible jokes and learn more about your world and maybe figure out how to raise hybrid children, if that's even biologically possible. I want everything that promise implied, but for real reasons rather than obligatory ones. He paused, then added, but I need you to be sure. You waited 25 years to fulfill a childhood vow. I need to know that what you're feeling now is about who I actually am, not about honoring a promise or satisfying nostalgia. I need to know you're choosing me, Thomas, not the memory of a lonely boy who hid you in a storage shed. Valerie was crying, tears streaming down her face in a way he'd only seen once before, the day she'd left. But she was also smiling, and when she spoke her voice was thick with emotion but absolutely certain. I have loved you since I was 12 years old, Thomas Ryder. I loved the boy who helped me when he had no reason to. But I have fallen in love again over these past months with the man who treats queens like people and explains crop rotation with genuine passion and makes me feel like I am more than my title. You are not the memory I carried forward. You are better than that memory. You are real, complicated, sometimes frustrating, always genuine. That is who I choose. That is who I want to spend my life with. She stood, closing the space between them, taking his hands in hers. Yes, I will marry you. I wanted to marry you 25 years ago because you were kind. I want to marry you now because you are everything I hoped you would grow into being, someone who sees me clearly and loves me anyway. Someone who values what I value. Someone who makes me better simply by being himself. Thomas pulled her into his arms, and they held each other while 2 months of careful consideration and 25 years of waiting, all resolved into this moment of certainty. When they finally pulled back enough to see each other's faces, both of them were crying and laughing simultaneously. So we're doing this? Thomas asked. Really doing this? Really doing this, Valerie confirmed. Though I warn you, my council is going to have extensive opinions about proper protocols. Royal weddings are typically enormous productions. Can we compromise? Something that honors both our cultures, but isn't so elaborate that I get lost in my own ceremony. I will negotiate with my advisors. You will be pleasantly surprised by my negotiating skills. I am quite effective when I want to be. I've seen you convince the Settlement Council to completely revise their water management systems in one meeting. I believe you. They spent the rest of the day planning, deciding practical things about how to blend their lives. Valerie would remain queen, but govern remotely when possible, visiting her homeworld for essential duties, but maintaining primary residence on Kepler 447d. Thomas would continue managing the settlement, but with support staff so he could occasionally travel with her. They'd build a larger home together, designed to accommodate both human and Valerie needs. And they'd figure out the complicated logistics of interspecies marriage as they went. The announcement to the colony that evening was met with genuine celebration. These people had watched Thomas and Valerie over 2 months, had seen their relationship develop from awkward reunion to comfortable partnership to something obviously deeper. They were happy for both of them and excited about the prestige of hosting a royal wedding. The announcement to Valerie's council, conducted via holographic communication, was less enthusiastic but not actually opposed. Her advisors had spent 2 months observing their queen's happiness and noting that she governed more effectively now than she had in years. They made formal objections about protocols and propriety, but ultimately agreed to support the union and help arrange a wedding that honored both species' traditions. Earth's government was frantically excited about the political implications and immediately began negotiating formal treaties with the Valari Empire. Thomas ignored most of that. Let the diplomats handle politics. He had a wedding to plan. The ceremony took place 3 months later, after elaborate preparations that tried to balance Valari tradition with human customs. It was held outdoors on Kepler 447d, in the fields where Thomas worked, under the same sky where they'd both seen stars from different perspectives as children. Valerie wore traditional Valari royal ceremonial attire, that starlight-woven fabric that shifted colors, but incorporated human elements into the design. Thomas wore human formal wear modified with Valari aesthetic touches. Both sets of families attended, Thomas's parents openly crying, Valari's noble relatives carefully maintaining diplomatic composure while clearly pleased their queen was happy. The vows they exchanged were written together, blending both cultures' marriage traditions. Thomas promised to honor her strength while supporting her vulnerability. Valari promised to value his wisdom while bringing her power to protect what they built together. They promised partnership, honesty, shared adventure, and mutual growth. And they both referenced, with appropriate humor, the promise made by children under distant stars that had become foundation for something neither could have imagined at 12. When the ceremony concluded, and they were formally bonded under both human and Valari law, Thomas and Valari stood together facing the assembled guests from 2 species, and realized they'd just created something unprecedented. Not just marriage but symbol of possibility. That species could find common ground, that childhood promises could grow into adult commitment, that love could transcend distance and difference if people were willing to try. The celebration lasted for days. Valari's people brought traditional music and dancing that humans attempted to learn, with varying degrees of success. Humans introduced Valari guests to barbecue and campfire songs. Children from both species played together, finding common language through games that required no translation. And through it all, Thomas and Valari stayed together, sometimes at the center of celebration but often finding quiet moments at the edges, just existing beside each other as they'd learned to do over months of courtship. On their wedding night, in the new home they'd built together, structure that blended human practicality with Valari elegance, they lay together and talked about futures still unwritten. "Do you think we'll have children?" Valerie asked, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. "Is that even biologically possible?" "No idea, but I'd like to try if you would. It would be interesting to see what combination of traits they'd inherit." "Your terrible jokes and my competence with weapons. The universe should be terrified." Thomas laughed. "Fair point. Though I'd hope they'd also get your intelligence and my practical problem-solving. That would be a good combination." "Whatever they inherit, they will know they were wanted," Valari said softly. "They will know their parents chose each other freely, not from obligation or politics. That seems important." "It is important. It's the most important thing." They fell into comfortable silence, the kind that had become natural between them. Thomas thought about the lonely 12-year-old who'd hidden an alien girl in his storage shed, never imagining that action would lead here. Thought about Valari spending 25 years becoming the kind of leader who could fulfill a promise that everyone else would have dismissed as childish fantasy. "Thank you," he said into the darkness, "for keeping your promise, for traveling all this way, for giving me chance to know you again." "Thank you for seeing me," Valari replied, "for seeing me then when I was frightened and alone, and for seeing me now as more than queen. That gift is why I returned. That gift is why I love you." Outside their window, Kepler 447D's two moons rose over fields Thomas had worked for decades, over the settlement that had become home, over the world where two children had met and made impossible promise that became foundation for future neither species had anticipated. The promise made under distant stars had been kept. The childhood vow had grown into adult commitment, and two people from different worlds had proven that sometimes the most important things in the universe start with small acts of kindness and grow into something that changes everything. Thomas and Valari fell asleep holding each other, two species bridged through love, two children grown into partners who'd chosen each other freely despite all the logical reasons they shouldn't work. They'd figure out ruling an empire and managing a farm. They'd navigate political complications and cultural differences. They'd probably face challenges neither could anticipate. But they'd face everything together, bound not by childhood promise but by adult choice, proving that some vows transcend time and distance when they're made by hearts that recognize something true. The story of the lonely boy and the frightened girl had become the story of the farmer and the queen, and it was just beginning.